By the end of this video, you will have the knowledge that you need to immediately increase your damage on any class with any build. Now, I have tons of build guides on both YouTube and the brand new website that will hold your hand step by step, tell you exactly what to run and what buttons to press. But in the grand scheme of things, you cannot just be told what to do in ESO and expect to succeed. You need to really understand the way dealing damage works in order to get big numbers so that you can make good decisions when it comes to situationally tweaking your rotation and build depending on your scenario. And that is exactly what this video is going to teach you how to do. Everybody would like you to think that ESO is this crazy complex game that has a super high skill gap, but that is just objectively untrue. The reason the game feels hard is because well over 90% of ESO players don't truly understand the why behind basic damage concepts. We hear things like rotation and we think to ourselves, okay, buttons I'm supposed to press in a certain order. And while that's kind of sort of true, it's really only a good intro into the concept, and unfortunately nobody explains the next step. So let's start this video by breaking down exactly what a rotation is. Now, skills in ESO fall into one of two primary categories: direct damage or damage over time. The best example of a direct damage skill would be a spammable, something like Molten Whip on the DK, Venom Skull on a Necro, or even Surprise Attack on a Nightblade. Damage over time abilities, otherwise known as dots, are abilities that deal X amount of damage over X period of time. An example of this type of skill could be Wall of Elements, or maybe Engulfing Flames on a DK, Winter's Revenge on a Warden, or Fulminating Rune on an Arcanist. There is then a second category abilities fall into: single target or area of effect, but this creates a pretty complicated categorization depending on the ability, and especially if it does two different damage types, so I'll reserve this full breakdown for a future video. Now, in ESO, dealing damage is based on the skills that you cast and how quickly you cast them. The game places a generous limit though on how many skills you can cast at one time, and this is known as the global cooldown, or GCD. This mechanic prevents you from casting any more than one skill per second. So when we talk about comparing the damage value of one ability versus another, we do so based on this 1 second GCD. How much damage does an ability do in 1 second, which could be another way of saying how much damage does an ability do in one cast. If I cast X skill, how does that compare to a cast of Y skill? So when looking at damage over time effects, for example, let's take the Mage's Guild skill Degeneration. This ability ticks once every 2 seconds, hitting at roughly 8k per tick. Compare this to a direct damage ability like Molten Whip, which does 60k in 1 second or 60k in one cast, and you might think, wow, degen is just terrible, I'll spam whip instead. But however, you would be neglecting what a cast of Degeneration is worth. See, one cast of degen is actually worth 88k, because this skill will tick for 22 seconds. 8k once every 2 seconds, so 8 times 11, means that degen will produce a DPS value more than that of whip for one single cast. And this concept, this is why skills that do damage over time are worth running at all. Any damage over time ability that will do more damage over its entire duration, that will do more damage than one cast of your primary spammable, will be worth using. Now, in the sense of a basic parse dummy rotation, there is only one mistake that you can make as a player to make this statement untrue, and this will introduce our first golden rule for parsing. You should almost never reapply a dot early. Let's look at the basic math here. I make one cast of degen. That makes this cast worth 88k, as long as I can wait 22 seconds. However, if I reapply Degeneration early, say 11 seconds in, that initial cast is no longer worth 88k. It's now only worth 44. That means that a 60k whip would have been a more valuable cast than using degen if we're only going to get half of Degeneration's duration. And this is what an entire rotation is built around. On any DPS spec, we only slot damage over time effects, so long as one cast of that dot will result in more total damage than one cast of our spammable. And we run a spammable at all because at some point, all of our dots will be active. So there will be moments where we have nothing that needs reapplied. In those moments, we should be hitting our spammable or filler ability, allowing our dots to cook, and then we prioritize the reapplication of those dots, ideally reapplying them right as they run out. Using our filler ability at all introduces golden rule number 2. In other MMOs, you might have heard of the ABCs of dealing damage, and this stands for always be casting. In ESO, you'll most often hear this referred to as time on target. Every second you spend not casting something, not hitting your enemy with something, is a big, and I mean massive, damage loss. Seriously, you really are just better off spamming random buttons than you are just sitting there heavy attacking and casting nothing. Constantly dealing damage damage as quickly as the game's global cooldown will allow you to is step 1 in dealing good damage. And then step 2 is mastering this basic rotation, keeping damage over time effects active, prioritizing them when they need reapplied, attempting to not reapply them early, and then using your spammable when no dot needs reapplied. As a note, all of my beginner static rotations don't follow this rule perfectly. Some dots are reapplied too early and some too late, and this middle ground is necessary to create a truly static and repeatable rotation. Timer management isn't perfect though, and this is why a static rotation will always be around 5k DPS less than that of a dynamic rotation. Perhaps the second most misunderstood concept in ESO is weaving. I've heard so many times, even from the devs themselves, that ESO is a high APM game, that your weave speed needs to be fast to be good. Everybody is so focused on speed, but do me a favor, pick up a controller or sit at your keyboard and just spam a key as quickly as you can. Look, I'll do it with you. Oh wait, that's right. I wanted to do it while talking. I can get about 7 to 9 clicks per second, and I'm not even a good button masher. Now, what if I told you in ESO, all you need to do is hit 2 buttons per second? That looks something like this. That seems way less intimidating, right? For most people, this isn't fast at all. No, see, a rotation in ESO has very little to do with actual speed, but everything to do with timing and consistency with your timing. Let's break it down. At its core, a light attack weave simply attempts to place a light attack between casts of your skill, while still firing skills exactly 1 second apart on that global cooldown that we talked about earlier. In order to light attack weave properly, we need to understand something called the Q window. If we look at the global cooldown as a timeline, the last 400 to 600 milliseconds is where the Q window is, and essentially anything that you click in this window will queue to be cast as soon as the global cooldown has finished. So if I hit whip, for example, then hit whip again before the global cooldown is up in this Q window, whip will auto fire. However, you can only have 1 cast queued at a time, and this window will always choose your most recent cast to fire next. See, ever had it happen where you casted a light attack skill combo and the light attack didn't fire? This game is so bad, right? And I mean, sometimes, but as hard as it is to hear, more often than not, we're just bad. This means that we casted a skill too early, causing our skill cast to be queued over the light attack, and therefore the light attack to get skipped altogether. This is also why button mashers tend to weave a bit more poorly, and trust me, I was one of them. Breaking this habit was miserable. So the goal then on this timeline is to cast a skill, wait until the Q window is open, fire a light attack in this Q window, and then cast a skill the millisecond that 1 second GCD is ready, prioritizing not being early on that window so that we don't cancel our light attack. It's a lot of words, but it's as simple as skill, light attack skill, light attack skill, light attack skill, with the tempo being the most important part. Avoid spamming your next ability because you'll mess up that Q window, and instead practice maintaining a consistent beat or pattern. My college degree was in drumming, so keeping a steady tempo is something that I have a lot of practice in both doing and teaching. And for this reason, I'll dive into exactly how I would go about practicing this concept in a future video coming very soon. But for now, do me a favor, Google the word metronome if you're unfamiliar with the term, download a free one on your phone, and set it to 60 BPM if you really want to get a feel for what this should look like. That truly is all of the skill involved in this game, and it does take practice, and getting to the absolute top tier level takes thousands of hours. I'm not trying to understate that. However, getting to say 100k doesn't even take 10 hours if you just understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. That 10 hours becomes even more possible though if you can expedite the true prog in ESO, which isn't this mythical skill gap, but rather a very real and widely unaddressed knowledge gap. Understanding how to optimize your build, not just copy paste whatever a video says to do, but really understanding how to make tweaks to fine-tune the performance of your build in any given situation is the last key component to good damage. Now, I truly could spend hundreds of hours on this topic, but I'm going to break down the main points quickly and try to make it as easy for you to understand as possible without leaving any info out. Optimization in ESO is based on our stats and then the major minor buff and debuff system. Our character sheet is widely deceiving and very unhelpful from the PvE standpoint because of an effect known as a debuff. A debuff will make us stronger by weakening an enemy, and despite this net increase in a stat, taking something away from a target doesn't then add to our our stats, and therefore that difference isn't reflected in our character sheet. This is mostly important from the standpoint of two key stats: penetration and critical damage. These are the two most important stats in the game, so strong in fact that they have hard caps. This means that once you get to a certain value of either stat, the game will not let you benefit from adding any more. For penetration, this value is reached at 18,200 for every single 4 and 12-man enemy, and in solo content this value can vary. Penetration simply measures the amount of armor that we ignore. All 4 and 12-man enemies have 18,200 armor, and solo enemies range from 9,100 to 18,200. So it's a little trickier to optimize in these environments. But since 18,200 armor is all a target will ever have, having 19k pen, for example, will have 0 additional benefit compared to having 18,200. Our other stat, critical damage, simply increases the amount of damage our critical strikes do. At base, a crit will deal 50% more damage than a non-crit attack, but we can buff this value so that we'll do up to 125% more damage instead. This is the crit damage cap. If we're at 130% crit damage, for example, our attacks will still only do that 125% increased damage. There are a lot of different ways that we can reach these values, and maximizing damage in ESO simply involves finding the most efficient sources of these buffs. Just because a source exists doesn't mean that we should use it. For example, we can increase our crit damage if we choose the Khajiit race. However, in 12-man content, there are so many other ways that we can source crit damage that it makes more sense to let our allies buff us and debuff our targets to reach this cap than to try to get there with our race. So instead, we can choose something that's going to increase our raw damage with a race like Dark Elf. However, in 4-man content, we only have 1, maybe 2 supports in the tank and healer. So there are far less ways to reach that crit damage cap than there are in 12-man, and in these scenarios, we almost have to be Khajiit to reach the crit damage cap. So choosing this race for this environment becomes far more useful. If you can get a good head on your shoulders for really critically thinking about what the most efficient source of a buff is compared to another option, you will be very successful in ESO very quickly. This takes skills in both knowing what options for a buff exist, and then skills in discerning which source to choose. An example I see all the time is with a skill Banner Bearer, where people typically choose the Heroism Affect script, and this is not, nor will it ever be, the most efficient source of minor heroism, especially when considering current meta setups. Minor heroism through our potions will always be the best way to get the buff. However, ult pots are still absurdly expensive because raiding can't be cheap and accessible, I guess, I don't know. So a lot of groups will take the small damage loss by running Heroism Banner because it's better to have the buff than to not have it at all. We just need to understand that it's not the most optimal choice. It's a choice for easier raiding, and a completely fine one at that. As a final example, a choice that a lot of newer groups make that never makes sense is placing igneous weapons on the buff damage dealer, historically a role known as Zenkosh. Now, this might change a little with subclassing, but in general, this is almost always a terrible idea. Now, if you've seen my recent VKA record where I did play the Zenkosh role, you might think that I'm a hypocrite because I ran igneous weapons. But please do not get in the habit of copying comps from top-level groups. There are very niche and nuanced optimizations that we make for very specific reasons. This group, for example, had 10 damage dealers, which meant 1 tank and 1 healer, and we chose a Warden tank and Crow healer, so I was the only DK in group, and therefore the only option for igneous weapons. It is the only reason that it was on my bar. It's better to have a DD run the skill with a damage loss than to not have the ability in group at all. In far more standard 4 support comps with 2 tanks and 2 healers, and this is a comp that's way better for progression-oriented groups, you'll almost always have a tank that has access to the Earthenheart tree. So that tank should always run igneous weapons, no exception. It's a huge damage loss to have a DD run that skill, and that damage loss is only worthwhile if the only other option is to not have the ability. So as you can see, this topic can get very complicated. So as a general rule that you can take home and understand today for your build, make sure that you hit the 18,200 pen cap, the 125% crit damage cap, and then start looking at major and minor damage buffs and debuffs. Now, the major minor system is pretty simple. You can't ever stack multiple sources of the same major or the same minor buff, but you can have the major and minor buff at one time, and you always should have a source of it when you can. For example, Boneyard and Elemental Susceptibility both give Major Breach, and this debuffs an enemy by nearly 6k pen. We cannot stack 2 sources of Major Breach and get 12k out of it, but we can stack Major Breach for 6k and Minor Breach for another 3k with a skill like Shocks, for a total of 9k between those 2 buff types. In 12-man content, you should be able to get every single damage-oriented major and minor buff and debuff. However, in 4-man or solo, get as many as you reasonably can without removing important damage abilities. This last portion of the video I'm going to use to quickly walk you through the buffs you're probably going to need to source yourself, and I'll reserve a full breakdown of all the buffs and debuffs a good raid comp should have in general for a future video. So first, to hit the pen cap, this should be done almost exclusively by your support, with the only exception being our passive CP piercing, which gives 700 pen. However, if you are below the pen cap for whatever reason, the most common sources that we use to make up for some missing pen would be to add one light piece of armor for the concentration passive worth 939, running a monster set that offers a line of pen worth nearly 1500, or in extreme cases the CP slottable Force of Nature, which gives pen per status effect on a target, though this shouldn't ever be necessary. To hit the crit damage cap, again, this should mostly be done by your support. However, you are responsible for minor force, usually sourced from the Velothir Mage's Amulet Mythic or Barb Trap, 12 to 14% crit damage from the Dexterity passive in the Medium Armor tree, which gives 2% crit damage per piece of medium armor equipped, and then from our meta skill line passives, Fated Fortune from Herald of the Tome worth 12%, and the Hemorrhage passive from the Assassination tree worth 10%. If you can't run some of these options and will be below the crit cap for whatever reason, the most common sources that we use to make up for some missing crit damage buffs would be a CP slottable like Fighting Finesse or Backstabber, and in solo and 4-man content, combinations that involve the Khajiit race, Shadow Mundus, and rarely the sets Order's Wrath and Soulzon could be used to make up for some gaps as well. Now, outside of these small tweaks that you can make to hit these caps, all we have left are the rest of our important damage buffs and debuffs. Again, I'm just going to focus on the ones that you are responsible for and reserve a complete list for a future video in this series. First, the buffs that you can source on your own, one of the easiest being Minor Slayer. Minor Slayer is a unique buff that only comes from trial sets as the third piece bonus, and luckily lots of trial sets are in the meta right now, so you should always have this. Even getting an unperfected set from a normal trial will get you this awesome buff, so it really should be a goal to have one trial set in your build whenever possible. Next, major intellect or endurance, your major mag and stam recovery buffs should be sourced through your potions, whether that's a weapon damage, spell damage, tripot, or heroism pot. You should only ever use one of these 4 potions and use the one that correlates with your highest resource pool. Heroism pots are the strongest options to source minor heroism as well, but they are extremely expensive, so you can run heroism affixes on the DD's banner instead so that you can just use tripods. Finally, major sorcery and brutality and major prophecy and savagery are buffs that can have varying sources, so we just need to make sure that they're there. Our major sorcery and brutality buffs, that is our major spell and weapon damage buffs, should come from support using the DK's Earthen Heart tree for igneous weapons. However, if this is not being done, we must run spell or weapon damage potions to source this buff, unless you have a skill like Inspired Scholarship or Degeneration that offers it for you. Our major prophecy and savagery buffs, that is our major spell and weapon crit buffs, should be sourced by a class ability. Examples include Flames of Oblivion on a DK, Detonating Siphon on the Crow, or at worst, Camo Hunter for classes like Arcanist that don't have a strong class skill to give this buff. The minor iterations of all 4 of these buffs come from unique class passives, and you only need one of each pair since damage in ESO scales based on your highest offensive stat. So the DK's Earthen Heart passive, Mountain's Blessing, gives minor brutality. So if you have a support running the Earthen Heart tree, you will not need minor sorcery from the Templar passive Illuminate in the Dawn's Wrath tree. Likewise, the DD meta incorporates the Assassination tree, which has the Hemorrhage passive that offers minor savagery, so you won't ever need the Sorcerer's Exploitation passive from the Dark Magic tree that gives minor prophecy. So as long as you have a DK's Earthen Heart tree and a Nightblade's Assassination tree on somebody in group, you're good with these minor buffs. And as you can see, knowing how things work is truly the barrier to entry in ESO. The game is not difficult to play, it's just extremely complex and difficult to learn. And that's why this is the first of a 10 video series that I'm working on to break down the mysteries and complexities surrounding dealing good damage in ESO. Video 2 in this series dives into the rotation, how it works, what it is, and how to practice and improve it, which you can check out here. And if this video hasn't popped up yet, don't worry, it's on the way. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel so that you can be among the first to see when it goes live.
I prefer rock hard. Sorry, stuttered. I prefer rock hard. Hold on, let me go.